Incredible discourse.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Incredible Discourse. Today we're going to be looking at North Korea and learning a little bit more about this mysterious nation state. Now, when you think of North Korea, you may be thinking socialist paradise, nestled between China and South Korea. You may be thinking about their beautiful landscapes, abundant food, or impeccable weather. But you may be asking yourself, why the love of nuclear weapons? Why does lubricant fascinate Kim Jong-un so much? Will we ever discover what Kim Il-sung is pointing at in this painting? Well, whatever you may think of North Korea, it hasn't always been easy for them, because the history of North Korea is also the history of all of Korea. You may be surprised to learn that the history of North Korea is full of struggle and invasion. So, why would the leaders of North Korea be so isolationist and hostile towards their neighbors? Well, let's have a seat and see what's been going on in North Korea and find out how they started. Today on Incredible Discourse, I want to frame the periods for you. We're going to be covering long periods of time, so I think it's best that I lay down this roadmap. We can think of the history of the Korean Peninsula as being split into 4 distinct eras. Note, these aren't technical eras, but I think that they work for our purposes here. Our first period is the longest, stretching from people first moving into the Korean Peninsula to around 100 to 300 CE. This is the pre-Three Kingdoms period. Our first period stretches from the first people moving into the Korean Peninsula until around 100 to 300 CE. This is going to be the pre-Three Kingdoms period. For the following 600 years, there was the Three Kingdoms period. And starting around 900 CE, we'll see the dawn of a united Korea. But this will sadly not last, and in 1945, Korea will be divided. So there you have it, the 4 periods. The pre-Three Kingdoms period, the Three Kingdoms period, a united Korea, a divided Korea. But let's bring it back and take a look at its first historical age. So we're going to go look at Joseon. Joseon is considered the first kingdom on the Korean Peninsula. It was founded by Dangun, the son of a heavenly prince and a bear woman. Joseon was established in 2333 BC. This is the long period of early history that saw the beginning of rice agriculture and the development of bronze and iron technology. During the tail end of this period, people from the southeast region of the peninsula started to migrate into an archipelago called Wa. They brought with them rice, bronze, and iron, but we'll get back to that later. And, like all good things, Joseon came to an end. In 108 BCE, the Han overtook the peninsula, breaking it into separate commanderies, which were military districts. This begins the transition from the pre-Three Kingdoms period into the Three Kingdoms period. And a lot happened over those next 400 years. The Han commanderies fell, and local city-states consolidated power, forming 3 distinct kingdoms by 300 CE. The 3 kingdoms that emerged were Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla. Goguryeo was the first to emerge, and it came out swinging. It quickly established itself as a military power and pushed north, seizing territory from the Han into modern-day Manchuria. Its capital was centered around modern-day Pyongyang. Next was Baekje. Baekje was founded by the sons of the founder of Goguryeo. It became a naval power with its capital near modern-day Seoul. Silla, being the smallest and weakest of the 3 kingdoms, was founded through an expansion of the Jihad Confederacy. This map shows Gaya, which was another confederacy that was quickly absorbed by Silla. Although there were separate kingdoms on the peninsula, the Ming Chinese referred to them collectively as Samhan. This is also where the modern name for Korea comes from, Han, as in Daihan, or the Great Han. Despite the similarities, the Han in Korea is different than the Han of the ethnic Han Chinese. As time passed, both Baekje and Silla developed strong ties with the archipelago of Wa, sending people and technology. It's thought that nobles from these two kingdoms were and are the ancestors of the Japanese imperial line. In the same way that Silla went from confederacy to kingdom by absorbing and unifying surrounding city-states, once it became a proper kingdom, it continued these habits. Because Silla was the smallest and weakest militarily of the three kingdoms, it worked its magic, making friends with China and leveraging that friendship and political power until it threatened and annexed both Baekje and Goguryeo. So, although Silla controlled the former territories of Baekje and Goguryeo, the populations of those territories did not assimilate well. They started to be resentful of their Silla rulers. This is a theme that we're going to see come back in the future. And the result of this tension among the population led to a revolution. Remember, now the founders of Baekje were the sons of the founder of Goguryeo. So there was a family connection between these two kingdoms. The people of Baekje, led by General Geon, and the people of Goguryeo, led by General Ye, rallied their forces against Silla and ultimately gained independence. Goguryeo emerged as Taibao, but after only 3 months was overturned by former Goguryeo nobles, and Goryeo was formed. Goryeo quickly absorbed Silla and then crushed Baekje resistance until uniting the Korean Peninsula under one ruler for the first time. This new kingdom of Goryeo is also sometimes referred to as Koryo, and this is where we get the English word for Korea today. Also, with the forming of Goryeo, we have the end of the Three Kingdoms period and the beginning of a unified Korea. And even though it was united, in the 1200s, the Mongols invaded 6 times, and Koryo soon became a vassal state to the Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, the founder and ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China and the Greater Far East. In a move to gain greater levels of autonomy, the Koryo king married a daughter of Kublai Khan. Koryo then proceeded to assist the Mongols in their campaigns against Japan and attempted invasions of the home islands. Goguryeo contributed approximately 1,670 ships throughout both invasion attempts. It was not until the late 14th century that Koryo was able to push the Mongols out of the peninsula. This was partly due to the Han re-establishing control over China and founding the Ming dynasty. It was then that Koryo moved and reclaimed its former territories in the north, in what is today Manchuria. The Han responded by launching a campaign against Koryo. The ruler of Koryo, King Wu, sent General Yi north with an army to repel the Han. The only problem was that General Yi supported the Han and turned his army back around on the capital and overthrew the Koryo court. A possible reason for Yi's coup could be attributed to Yi being the son of a Mongol official and a Chinese mother. He did not wish for conflict with Ming and established a new kingdom. But once Yi became ruler, he wanted to keep the name Koryo because of the long legacy it held. But there were threats of mutiny from the remaining Koryo nobles. So, with a little help from the Han, the new kingdom took its name Joseon, hearkening back to Go-Joseon and establishing Dangun as an ancestor. Thus begins the Kingdom of Joseon. There were 6 kings during the early Joseon period, the first 3 of them in the first 30 years, until Sejong the Great came and ushered in an age of high culture and the invention of Hangul, the modern Korean alphabet. Today, Hangul is considered by linguists to be one of, if not the best alphabet in terms of uniformity and intuitiveness. Following the reign of Sejong the Great was characterized by more instability and fractional struggles. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and in 1592, Japan invaded Korea. The invasion of Joseon by Japan was conducted by none other than Japan's second great unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. After Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi inherits his territory and continues to expand, unifying more of the main island, Honshu. Hideyoshi sets his eyes on Korea, with the expectation of continuing on to take China as well. Armed with new firearms, he sends a force of over 158,000 into the Korean Peninsula. During the first invasion, within a matter of months, the Japanese army had taken the peninsula and was poised to march on Ming China. In the north, they were met with a Ming army coming down on them hard, and the Joseon Navy cutting off their supplies. This situation led to a stalemate and eventually a peace treaty signed in 1596, although it failed. But the first failed attempt didn't slow down Hideyoshi. He came back the following year with another force of 140,000. This time, Joseon itself was the primary target. The only problem is that Hideyoshi dies the following year, and the Japanese pulled their forces out. After the invasions from Japan, Joseon was putting itself back together, and to the north, the Jurchen tribes were forming into a Manchu alliance. This would later become Manchuria. The Manchus then went on to conquer the Han Chinese and founded the Qing dynasty. This would be China's last dynasty. The ruler of Joseon supported and aided the Manchus in their struggle against the Han. This got him dethroned. But, as it turns out, the Manchus won. Yay! And with a force of 30,000 soldiers, moved into the Korean Peninsula and forced Joseon to stop supporting the Han Chinese. Problems arose when Joseon kept acting up, and another force of 120,000 was sent in to impose harsher punishments on Joseon and eventually establish it as a vassal state of the Qing dynasty. After these invasions, and as a vassal state of the Qing, Joseon experienced a 200-year period of peace and prosperity. This is also the period where Joseon adopted strong isolationist policies. It would not be until the mid-19th century that advancing Western powers would cause trouble in the peninsula. So now we fast forward to the 19th century where Western powers are causing trouble in the peninsula. In response to the Opium Wars between China and Britain, Joseon adopted harsher restrictions on all things foreign. This included foreign religions such as Christianity. In January 1866, Russian ships landed demanding trade. At that time, 12 French Catholic missionaries were in Joseon, and over 23,000 Koreans had converted to Catholicism. The French missionaries proposed an alliance between France and Joseon. In response to this alliance, the Joseon king executed the French missionaries. In June, 3 of those missionaries managed to escape and make it back to French ships. In response to this, the French vowed to kill 9,000 Koreans in a punitive expedition. The following month, in July, a stalwart American vessel attempted to establish trade via force. The USS General Sherman set sail for Pyongyang. But at this point, Joseon was very familiar with what an invading vessel looked like, and they were not fans. So they sunk the USS General Sherman. The sinking of the General Sherman is something that the U.S. would not retaliate against for another 5 years. In 1971, the U.S. returned to Joseon and attacked the last place the Koreans would have thought, the same place the French did 5 years earlier. And speaking about the French 5 years earlier, in September of 1866, the French set a punitive force to punish the Koreans. They assaulted an island that protected the mouth of the river leading to Seoul. The French assault lasted several weeks and led to the death of 8 Koreans. This is the same island that the Americans attacked 5 years later. The American expedition was more for trying to establish trade as it was for avenging the General Sherman. This military campaign was a victory, but as far as trade negotiations went, was a complete failure. So the Joseon era of isolation was interrupted by Western powers twice, in 1866 and then in 1871. But not one for letting the Europeans and Americans have all the fun. In 1876, you guessed it, the newly established Meiji government of Japan took a shot at Korea. In 1876, a small Japanese warship under the command of Inoue Yoshika was dispatched to present a show of force and survey the coastal waters of Korea without permission. The Japanese ship went to the same island port that the French did, that the Americans did, and attacked it. And, as expected, as they approached the port fired upon the Japanese. The Japanese ship then decimated the port with superior firepower, and then sacked several other ports on its way home. This incident gave precedence for the Japanese to then send over a larger force to encourage trade. And when the Japanese returned, taking a page from the American playbook, they brought a fleet of warships to offer peace. The treaty was heavily in favor of the Japanese and took advantage of the Koreans at the time. It is at this point that Japan starts acting more like a Western power and is using those strategies to its advantage. Under the provisions of the treaty, the Korean people became very resentful of the Japanese and riots broke out. In an attempt to assist their vassal state, the Qing sent 3,000 troops in to help negotiate with the Japanese. This show of force was not taken kindly by the Meiji government, and in response they sent 5,000 soldiers in and seized the capital. This resulted in war breaking out on the Korean Peninsula between Japan and China, similar to Japan's invasion in the 16th century. But this time, Japan is facing a weakened China, and Japan overturns the Qing dynasty and China surrenders. This places Korea in Japan's new sphere of influence. In response to this, the Korean Empress became a strong anti-Japanese figure, seeking aid from Russia to help shrug off Japanese influence. The Meiji government saw her as an obstacle to maintaining their sphere of influence over Korea, and on October 8, 1895, she was assassinated. The assassination not only sent the king to seek Russian protection, but further cemented resentment of the Japanese. 2 years after this, the new Empire of Korea is declared, or the Great Empire of Daehan, establishing the modern-day name for the country, Daehan. This name coming from the term used by China to describe the three kingdoms, Han. Partially due to the Qing losing to the Japanese, the Korean Empire shook off its allegiance to them as a tributary state, and in the same stroke they declared a refusal to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Emperor of Japan. This ended China's influence on Korea for the time being, although Russia and Japan still held great power on the peninsula. And it is because of this shared power on the peninsula that Russia and Japan went to war. And that war ended in 1905, with Japan consolidating its influence over the Korean Empire. From this victory, the Japan-Korean Treaty of 1905 was ratified, although unwillingly from the Korean side. This dissolved Korea's diplomatic sovereignty and made Korea a protectorate under the Empire of Japan. 2 years later, in 1907, Korea sent delegates to the Hague International Peace Conference in the Netherlands to argue for Western support to help an independent Korea. This failed. Not only did Korea receive no help from the Hague International Peace Conference, in 1910, with the support of the United States and Great Britain, Japan annexes Korea, making it officially a part of the Japanese Empire. The Korean Empire and the Korean Emperor sign over all rights of sovereignty over the whole of Korea. Under Japanese rule, in April of 1919, a new constitution for the Republic of Korea is presented to the world. The provisional government of the Republic of Korea then begins to struggle against the Japanese government from then until the end of World War II. During its struggle, it received support from Russia, China, and France. This would set the stage for the support North Korea would get once World War II came to a close. At the end of World War II, the Korean Peninsula was divided, ending a unified Korea period and beginning the divided Korea period. The USSR claiming the northern half and the USA claiming the southern half. The Soviet Union, the US, the Republic of China, and Britain made a pact to support Korea for 5 years before helping them establish independence. The plan was for the Soviet Union and the U.S. to work together and allow the Korean people to become independent. In 1946, the Soviet Union proposed a leader that would take over both zones, but this was rejected by the U.S. Tensions from the Cold War made issues over Korea more and more difficult to work out between the Soviet Union and the U.S. In the final meeting between the two powers, the Soviet Union proposed that both nations pull their militaries out of Korea and allow the Koreans self-government. But the U.S. was not on board with that idea. The U.S. took the idea of running elections for the Koreans to the UN, who supported the proposal. The Soviet Union refused to support it because of fear of corruption. But the UN decided that if the Soviet Union did not want to have elections, that they would be held in the South only. This separate elections enraged the Korean people because it foreshadowed a permanently divided Korea. Post-World War II in the North. When the Soviet troops came into Korea at the end of the war, they helped set up a provisional government. And in 1946, Kim Il-sung rose to power. During the war, Kim Il-sung spent his time in the Soviet Union, where he was a major in the Red Army. Under the new communist government in the North, sweeping land reform was enacted, seizing land previously held by the Japanese and Japanese sympathizers to be redistributed to poor farmers. Both the Soviet Union and China recognized Kim's Communist Party as the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. This is partly because they helped create it, and historically speaking, Russians and Chinese had a history of helping Korea maintain its independence. During this time, conferences to unite the North and South were taking place in Pyongyang, which were rejected not only by the United States, but by the U.S.'s delegates in South Korea. Meanwhile, in the South, the Americans moved in quickly because Japan warned about the dangers of a power vacuum. Delegates from the exiled provisional government of Korea came back to Korea to meet with General Hodge, the administrator of Korean affairs. Hodge outlawed the provincial government of the Republic of Korea and established a temporary military government instead. As a result, there were massive revolts, but the U.S. forced an election to take place anyway. Syngman Lee, a once president of the provincial government and long-term resident in the United States, returned to Korea and became the first president under the U.S. elections. Lee pushed for the U.S. to form a separate state in the South and to not be overly concerned about the separate portion of the North, which was under Soviet influence. Between 1945 and the first election in the South, in 1948, U.S. troops killed between 30,000 and 100,000 Koreans. On Election Day in 1948, there were massive protests and acts of violence in opposition to the elections and the new government. It would be more than a year after the elections before U.S. troops would be pulled out of South Korea. In contrast, in 1948, the same year as the southern elections, Kim Il-sung became the premier of North Korea. And that same year, Soviet military pulled out. The Korean War. While Korea was being divided, between 1945 and 1949, China was heavily entrenched in a civil war between the communists and the nationalists. Well, 70,000 North Koreans showed up and helped the communists, and together they established the People's Republic of China. China was grateful and not only let them keep their weapons from the war, but promised to support them militarily in the future. So, in 1949, 70,000 armed veterans marched back down into North Korea. So remember how Korea was divided, and there was unrest and massive killings of citizens in the South by U.S. forces? Well, that didn't happen in the North. Kim Il-sung decides, hey, China, remember when we had to kick out Japan? Well, as you can see, the Western nations kind of fucked everything up. So I'm just going to go ahead and take South Korea. And China is on board. Kim then calls up Stalin and asks for some help to take the South. And with the backing of both the Soviet Union and China, Kim Il-sung marches into the South, expecting the people to welcome him and celebrate a united Korea. Yay! A fun fact is that 2 days before the war, CIA operatives on the border report that conflict was very unlikely. The Korean War starts with a bang. North Korea pushes down into the south with over 200,000 men in addition to tanks, artillery, and air support. On June 27th, President Lee abandons Seoul and detonates the Hangang Bridge, killing 4,000 refugees and trapping the Republic of Korean units in the north. Seoul fell that same day. 3 days later, the Republic of Korean Army was down to 22,000 strong, with many of their former soldiers turning to support the North. On July 5th, the North Koreans first hit U.S. forces, and even fighting the U.S., they took all but a small corner of the peninsula by September. The fighting would rage on until July 1953, when a stalemate was called. Post-war. After the war, the North received aid and debt forgiveness from the Soviet Union, China, and other Soviet bloc countries. There were some skirmishes along the border and assassinations, but overall relatively peaceful. North Korea tried to become a leader of the non-aligned movement as well. In 1965, the Juche ideology was put forward and emphasized to distinguish North Korea from the Soviet Union and China. The idea was put forward by Kim Il-sung, but not formally ratified until it was written down by Kim Jong-il, his son. And in 1994, Kim Il-sung dies, followed by the Great Famine. A combination of poor economic planning, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a series of droughts and floods caused a nationwide famine that lasted until 2000. This was one of the most defining events for North Korea since the war, and it is estimated that as many as 600,000 people starved to death during this time. Since then, levels of malnutrition have consistently declined, but due to the isolationist policies, they've still remained a problem for the country as a whole. The famine and the government response has led to the portrayal of Kim Jong-il as an incompetent leader and unable to properly manage the country. He was also criticized for the human rights violations being carried out under his government and the enormous number of political prisoners held in concentration camps. But in 2011, he died, and his son, Kim Jong-un, took over. Since coming to power, Kim Jong-un has been more like his grandfather, showing more concern for his people than his father did, and being more open to the world, such as meeting with Donald Trump, and not being killed by Seth Rogen. So, there you have it, the history of North Korea. But let's see if we can address some of the questions from earlier. You may be asking yourself, why the love of nuclear weapons? Well, because that stops the U.S. from killing Kim Jong-un and destroying North Korea. Why does lubricant fascinate Kim Jong-un so much? I don't know. Maybe I'll email him, and I'll get back to you. Will we ever discover what Kim Il-sung was pointing at in that painting? Well, Kim Il-sung is considered the star of Korea, so maybe he's pointing at a star and describing himself as top star. And then, why would the leaders of North Korea be so isolationist and hostile toward their neighbors? Well, we can see that isolationism came from bad relations with foreign powers, like every foreign power they ever came into contact with. I hope this has presented North Korea in a way to help contextualize some of the perspectives of North Korea for Westerners, which is difficult because North Korea is rarely ever depicted in the West as anything other than a cartoonish hellhole. So, the next time you think about North Korea, don't think so much about the lubricant-loving, nuclear-throwing dictators, but think about the history and the people of the peninsula. If you like this video, made it all the way through, please click the like and subscribe button. If you have any questions, please leave them for me below in the comment section, and I'll try to address them in an upcoming video.